Every civilization had to solve the same impossible problem. How do you feed millions of people, day after day, generation after generation? The answer wasn't gold. It wasn't meat. It wasn't spices. It was carbohydrates. Hidden inside grains, roots, and fruit, they became the fuel that powered farms, built cities, crossed oceans, and quietly shaped the world we live in today. Yet somehow, the very foods that once sustained humanity have become some of the most misunderstood foods on our plates. So today, we're traveling across continents and thousands of years of history to discover the world's most carbohydrate-rich foods, the science that makes them so powerful, and the remarkable stories behind the meals billions of people still eat every single day. Because once you understand carbohydrates, you don't just see food differently. You see human history differently. For something so important, carbohydrates are surprisingly misunderstood. For decades, they've been praised, criticized, avoided, and blamed for everything from weight gain to afternoon energy crashes. But carbohydrates aren't a single food. They're one of the three major macronutrients your body needs, alongside protein and fat, and one of its primary sources of energy. Glucose, the simplest carbohydrate used by the body, is especially important for the brain and becomes a major fuel source for working muscles during many forms of exercise. The real story, though, isn't about diets. It's about people, because every culture found its own way to capture the sun's energy and store it inside plants. Some chose rice, others relied on wheat. Some cultivated corn. Others dug potatoes from the ground or harvested bananas from tropical forests. Different landscapes created different staples, but they all answered the same question. How do you feed an entire civilization? Let's begin with the grain that has become a staple food for more than half of the world's population. Just after sunrise, before the highways fill with traffic and the cities begin to wake, millions of farmers are already standing ankle-deep in water. One seedling at a time, one row after another. It's work that has barely changed for thousands of years, and it all revolves around one remarkably simple grain: rice. Today, rice is a staple food for more than half of the world's population. From Tokyo and Bangkok to Delhi and Shanghai, it's part of everyday life. Some families eat it 3 times a day. Others build entire celebrations around it. Few foods are woven more deeply into human culture. Its journey began thousands of years ago in Asia, where early farmers discovered that rice thrived in flooded fields. The water helped suppress many weeds while creating ideal conditions for the crop to grow. Reliable harvests meant more food, larger communities, and eventually some of the world's earliest great civilizations, all from a grain no larger than a fingernail. Inside that tiny grain is a clever survival strategy. Most of its dry weight is made up of starch, the plant's way of storing energy until it's needed. When we eat cooked rice, our digestive system breaks much of that starch down into glucose, providing one of the body's most important sources of fuel. But rice is far more diverse than many people realize. Long-grain basmati stays light and separate, making it perfect for fragrant curries. Jasmine rice is prized for its soft texture and delicate floral aroma. Arborio releases more starch as it cooks, giving risotto its rich, creamy consistency. Glutinous rice, despite its name, contains almost no gluten. Instead, it's especially rich in a type of starch that gives it its famous sticky texture, making it ideal for dumplings, desserts, and countless traditional dishes across Southeast Asia. Even color changes the story. White rice has its bran and germ removed during milling, creating a softer texture and a longer shelf life. Brown rice keeps those outer layers intact, providing more fiber along with additional vitamins and minerals. And here's something most people never notice. Cook rice, let it cool, then reheat it the next day. A small portion of its starch changes into resistant starch, meaning it isn't fully digested in the small intestine and instead becomes food for beneficial gut bacteria in the large intestine. The bowl looks exactly the same, but inside, the chemistry has changed. Perhaps that's the secret behind rice. It isn't flashy, it isn't complicated. It simply does one job better than almost any other food on earth. It feeds billions of people every single day. If rice became the grain that fed billions, the potato became the root that changed a continent. High in the Andes Mountains of modern-day Peru and Bolivia, people were cultivating potatoes around 8,000 years ago. At elevations where many crops struggled to survive, this hardy plant flourished. Indigenous communities developed thousands of distinct varieties, selecting them for different climates, soils, colors, and flavors long before Europeans even knew the potato existed. Then, in the 16th century, Spanish explorers carried it across the Atlantic. At first, Europeans didn't know what to make of it. Some believed it was poisonous because it belonged to the nightshade family. Others simply distrusted a food that grew underground. For decades, potatoes were treated more as a curiosity than a staple. Eventually, necessity won. Farmers discovered that potatoes produced remarkable harvests from relatively small plots of land. They thrived in cool climates, grew in soils where other crops struggled, and provided a dependable source of calories year after year. As the potato spread across Europe, populations grew, diets improved, and entire regions became increasingly dependent on this simple underground crop. But here's something that surprises almost everyone. Potatoes aren't as carbohydrate-dense as their reputation suggests. In fact, a raw potato is nearly 80% water. That means a plain boiled potato contains considerably fewer carbohydrates per 100 grams than dry rice, dry pasta, or bread. The potato itself isn't the villain. The toppings often are. Deep fried into French fries, covered in butter, loaded with cheese, or sliced into potato chips. The humble potato becomes something completely different. Inside, however, the science is beautifully simple. Most of its carbohydrates are stored as starch, the plant's energy reserve for future growth. As the potato cooks, those starch granules absorb water and soften, creating the fluffy texture of mashed potatoes and the creamy interior of a perfectly baked potato. Then the chemistry changes once again. Allow cooked potatoes to cool, and a small portion of their starch becomes resistant starch. Like cooled rice, that starch isn't fully digested in the small intestine, and instead reaches the large intestine, where it can be fermented by beneficial gut bacteria. The potato may look ordinary, but for thousands of years, it has quietly done something extraordinary. It helped feed growing populations, not because it was rare, but because it was reliable. Sometimes history isn't changed by the most spectacular discoveries. Sometimes it's changed by dinner. Walk through almost any city on earth, and sooner or later you'll find pasta, served in tiny family-run trattorias in Rome, packed into lunchboxes in New York, stirred into fusion dishes in Tokyo, or shared around family tables where nobody speaks a word of Italian. Few foods have traveled farther, and even fewer have become such a universal symbol of comfort. But pasta's story doesn't begin in a restaurant. It begins in a wheat field. The vast majority of dried pasta is made from durum wheat, a hard variety of wheat that's naturally high in protein. When durum flour is mixed with water, those proteins link together to form gluten, creating an elastic network that gives pasta its strength and helps it keep its shape while cooking. Without that structure, there would be no spaghetti to twirl, no penne to hold rich sauces, and no lasagna sturdy enough to stack into layers. It's one of food's simplest engineering marvels. Watch fresh pasta being made. Flour drifts through the air. The dough is kneaded until it becomes smooth and elastic. Then it passes through rollers, again and again, until it becomes paper thin. From that same sheet of dough, dozens of completely different meals can emerge. Today, there are hundreds of pasta shapes, often estimated at more than 300, and almost everyone exists for a reason. Spaghetti pairs beautifully with lighter sauces. Rigatoni traps thick ragu inside its ridges. Farfalle catches butter between its folds. Tiny orzo disappears into soups. Large shells cradle creamy fillings. In Italy, shape isn't decoration, it's part of the recipe. Then comes one of the country's best-known cooking traditions. Al dente, literally, to the tooth. The pasta should remain slightly firm in the center. That texture isn't only satisfying, it also means the starch is generally less gelatinized than in heavily overcooked pasta, which can slow digestion slightly while preserving the bite that Italian cooks have prized for generations. There's another detail hiding in plain sight. Look at the nutrition label on a package of dry pasta, and the carbohydrate number seems enormous. Drop that same pasta into boiling water, and the numbers suddenly appear much lower. Nothing disappeared. The pasta simply absorbed a large amount of water, often nearly doubling in weight. The carbohydrates stayed exactly where they were. The serving just became heavier. Today, pasta belongs to the entire world. Fresh tagliatelle in Bologna, creamy carbonara in Rome, pesto in Genoa, mac and cheese in North America. Different recipes, different traditions, one humble grain that continues to bring people together around the table. Long before money, before governments, before even written language, there was bread. Archaeologists have discovered evidence of bread-like foods dating back around 14,000 years. Thousands of years before farming became widespread. People gathered wild grains, crushed them into coarse flour, mixed them with water, and baked simple flatbreads over hot stones. Then agriculture changed everything. As wheat and barley spread across the Fertile Crescent, bread became more than a meal. It became security. Grain could be harvested in summer, stored through winter, and shared when fresh food was scarce. Villages grew into towns, towns became cities, and some of the world's earliest civilizations were built on fields of grain. What's remarkable is how little bread actually requires: flour, water, salt, and for most modern loaves, yeast. Mix them together, and at first, almost nothing happens. Then millions of microscopic organisms begin to work. As yeast feeds on naturally occurring sugars, it releases carbon dioxide. Those tiny bubbles become trapped inside an elastic gluten network, slowly lifting the dough until it transforms into a light, airy loaf. It's one of the oldest examples of biotechnology still used in kitchens every single day. And every culture tells the story differently. France perfected the crisp baguette. Italy created airy ciabatta. Across the Middle East, pita puffs into a pocket inside scorching hot ovens. In India, naan bakes against the walls of a clay tandoor. Germany is home to hundreds of traditional bread varieties, many made with rye, seeds, and whole grains. Even the grain itself changes the final loaf. White bread uses refined flour, producing a softer texture but removing much of the bran and germ during milling. Whole grain bread keeps the entire kernel, naturally providing more fiber along with additional vitamins and minerals. Then there's sourdough. Instead of relying primarily on commercial yeast, it uses a living culture of wild yeast and naturally occurring bacteria. During a slow fermentation, those microorganisms develop the bread's distinctive tangy flavor, chewy texture, and complex aroma. Perhaps that's why bread feels different from almost every other food. It isn't simply eaten, it's shared. Across cultures, across generations, across thousands of years. Not every civilization was built on rice or wheat. Some learned to survive where those crops struggled. In the cool, rainy landscapes of Scotland, Scandinavia, and Northern Europe, farmers faced a different challenge. Growing wheat wasn't always practical. Oats were. They tolerated cooler temperatures and wetter soils better than many other cereal crops, making them an important staple across much of Northern Europe. For centuries, oats weren't fashionable, they were practical. Farmers ate porridge before sunrise. Shepherds carried sacks of oats into the hills. Sailors packed dried oats onto ships because they stored well and could be cooked almost anywhere with little more than water. Like other grains, oats store much of their energy as starch. But they also contain something unusual, a soluble fiber called beta-glucan. When oats are digested, beta-glucan absorbs water and forms a thick, gel-like solution that slows the movement of food through the digestive system. As a result, carbohydrates are absorbed more gradually, helping many people feel full for longer. Steel-cut oats, rolled oats, instant oats, 3 different breakfasts, one remarkably simple grain. Today, oats are found in granola, cookies, protein bars, smoothies, and oat milk. A grain once associated with simple farm life has become one of the most versatile foods in modern kitchens. If rice helped shape Asia, corn transformed the Americas. Around 9,000 years ago, people in what is now southern Mexico began cultivating a wild grass called teocinto. It looked nothing like modern corn. Its ears were tiny, its kernels were hard. Most people would have ignored it. Ancient farmers didn't. Generation after generation, they selected plants with larger ears and better harvests. The result was modern corn. For the Maya and Aztecs, maize wasn't simply another crop. It was sacred. It appeared in ceremonies, harvest festivals, and creation stories. Like every cereal grain we've explored, corn stores most of its energy as starch. Dry kernels became an efficient source of carbohydrates that could be stored for months and milled whenever food was needed. Then corn transformed again, ground into tortillas, cooked into creamy polenta, prepared as hominy for pozole, served as grits, roasted on the cob, or turned into popcorn. Inside every popcorn kernel is a tiny drop of water trapped beneath a hard shell. Heat turns that water into steam. Pressure builds. Then, pop. The kernel turns itself inside out. One of humanity's oldest crops still manages to surprise us. Not every carbohydrate grows in a field. Some grow in the tropics, on what is technically the world's largest herb. The banana plant may look like a tree, but it isn't one. Inside every banana, nature performs one of its most fascinating chemistry experiments. Green bananas aren't very sweet because much of their carbohydrates are still stored as starch, including a higher amount of resistant starch than ripe bananas. Over the next several days, enzymes break those starch molecules into smaller sugars. The peel changes from green to yellow to speckled brown. The fruit becomes softer, sweeter, more aromatic. Nothing has been added. The banana transforms itself. That's one reason bananas are so popular with athletes. They're portable, easy to eat, and as they ripen, they provide carbohydrates that are readily available for energy. They also contain potassium and vitamin B6, which support normal muscle and nerve function. The familiar Cavendish banana dominates global trade, but hundreds of varieties exist. Red bananas, finger bananas, blue Java bananas, and plantains. Across West Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America, plantains are fried, roasted, boiled, and mashed into traditional dishes that have fed families for generations. One family of plants, hundreds of varieties, countless traditions. At first glance, the sweet potato seems familiar. It grows underground. It's rich in carbohydrates, and it even shares part of its name with one of the world's most familiar vegetables. But despite the name, a sweet potato isn't actually a potato. Regular potatoes belong to the nightshade family. Sweet potatoes belong to the morning glory family. Archaeological evidence suggests sweet potatoes were first domesticated in Central or South America thousands of years ago, before spreading across the Pacific and eventually becoming staple crops in many parts of the world. Like potatoes, they store most of their carbohydrates as starch, but heat transforms them. As they roast, some of the starch breaks down into simpler sugars, creating their naturally sweet flavor. Orange varieties are rich in beta-carotene. Purple varieties contain anthocyanins. White varieties are firmer and less sweet. From Japanese street vendors to African stews and American holiday tables, the same root has inspired countless traditions. By now, you've probably noticed something. None of these foods became important because they were trendy. They became important because they worked. Rice, potatoes, pasta, bread, oats, corn, bananas, sweet potatoes. They all solved the same problem. How do you turn sunlight into something people can eat? Different climates produced different crops. Different cultures created different recipes. Yet they all arrived at the same remarkable discovery. Store the sun's energy inside a grain, a fruit, or a root, and you can feed a family, a village, or eventually an entire civilization. Maybe carbohydrates were never simply something to fear or something to celebrate. Maybe they were always something much more important. The invisible fuel that helped build the world we live in today. Because long before humanity built cities, crossed oceans, or reached for the stars, we first learned how to grow enough food to build a future. And in many ways, every high-carb food tells a small part of that extraordinary story.